Hi, I'm Leanpub from Leanpub, and in this episode of the Leanpub podcast, I'll be interviewing Dönmez. Based in Zurich, Dennis is an organizational developer who supports companies and leadership teams with his multifaceted expertise. He has helped numerous organizations establish structures that enable high performance, from startups to large corporations and NGOs and even theater companies. Dennis has implemented major transformation projects and established new understandings of leadership in many organizations, and his experience from international projects in diverse industries confirms that interdisciplinary teams succeed when they have the right structural conditions, and interdisciplinarity, I think, is something we might be talking about during this podcast. You can follow him on LinkedIn at Denniz Dönmez, and that's Z's where there's S's that I'm saying, and check out his website at enablingstructures.com. Dennis is the co-author of the book, Micro Habits for Better Teamwork, Psychological Hacks with Great Impact. In the book, Dennis and his co-author, Dr. Rafael Huber, provide a field guide for anyone who has ever sat in a meeting and thought, this could be so much better. Drawing on psychology, organizational research, and years of hands-on work with teams across industries, Dennis and Rafael have distilled the science of great collaboration into something refreshingly practical, small, learnable language habits. And I love that language habits idea that compound over time into genuinely better team culture. In this interview, we're going to talk about Dennis's background and career, the book, and a little bit about Dennis's approach to writing. So thank you very much, Dennis, for being on a Leanpub podcast.
Thanks for having me.
I always like to start these interviews by asking people for their origin story. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about where you grew up and how you built up your career as an organizational consultant and speaker.
Sure. So despite my name being Turkish, I grew up in Germany. I moved a lot around the world and ended up living in Switzerland 16 years ago. So 2010, I came to Zurich to do my PhD and have built a family since and stayed in Switzerland. And through my PhD, I also came into the field of organizational psychology. So my background is actually in engineering and economics. So it's pretty multidisciplinary there already. And then I learned from psychology that there's tons of team research. And I did some team research myself in the years at ETH Zurich, and came to learn a lot about what makes good teams and what behaviors we need and what structures we need in teams. So I've basically done that ever since.
And when you say engineering background, what kind of engineering?
I'm an electrical engineer by training.
Okay. Cool. Yeah, no, it's that we get lots of people using the word engineer on the podcast, and it can sometimes mean something different. So electrical engineer, you did the real hard stuff.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
Masters and a bit of work with engineering stuff and research. That was fun.
Yeah.
And I think I still think like I don't know if you come to be an engineer, or if you have this thinking by, I don't know, by nature, and then just become an engineer. I find in my work that I now I do consulting, and I often work with engineering teams, and I click somehow a lot with the engineering culture. It's a lot of fun to work with engineers.
When you were a kid, did you take things apart?
I did.
To know your
I
parents?
could not reassemble them.
Yeah.
My dad is also an engineer,
Oh,
and
okay.
he would laugh at kind of me taking things apart and not being able to put them back together. That was fun.
Yeah. No, that's a story I've heard from a lot of engineers over the years. And it's definitely as the resident non kind of programmer software engineer at Leanpub, I can definitely say, over the years working with engineers, I sort of there's a mindset that you discover and learn, and it's very true. Did you go to the LSE in London?
I did, yeah. I studied economics at the LSE, yes.
Okay. So now I'm going to ask a couple of selfish questions because I lived in London for about 9 years. So
Wow.
whenever I found out a guest lived in London, I like to ask them where they lived and what their experience was like. My first job was at the Aldwych,
Right.
in an office building right there, and so we would go to the LSE bar. That was our after work hangout. I forget, was it called the 3 Tons or something like that?
I don't recall.
I forget what it was called, but the LSE bar is where we hung out.
I actually spent only a short time there because I was doing the program at a distance, so I wasn't living
Okay.
in London.
Okay.
I was in London most of the time when I did my engineering master's in Cambridge. So that's when I went to I used the LSE library frequently. I just love the spiral library that there's the atmosphere. I love libraries. I used to hang out a lot in libraries for some reason. I like the atmosphere and the productive kind of spirit you have there.
Yeah. Well, and London and Cambridge have some pretty great libraries.
Mm.
The idea, the one thing I love them too, and one of the things I like about them is that everybody's there to think
Yeah.
and reflect. And there's a certain kind of energy that comes from being surrounded by other people who are in that quiet place
At
deliberately
least
to
it seemed
do
like
that.
it, right? And I don't dare to not kind of sit there and think about something, even though everybody else might be, I don't know, scrolling their social feed. But I think when I'm in a library, I get the feeling that it's quiet and it's focused for me. So I wrote a lot of the book in the library,
Oh,
basically.
really? Oh, I'm curious to find out about that later. And that there's a certain kind of excitement. I mean, talking to someone who's got a PhD, there's a certain kind of excitement that
Yeah.
comes from like engaging with like, wow, like, like look at what I made, or the thought I just had, the
Yeah.
thing that just occurred to me, the thing that just finally clicked into place.
Yeah. Yeah. I love that.
And so where did you live when you were in London when you were going to Cambridge?
I wasn't living in
Oh,
London
sorry.
at the time. I was living in Cambridge and then
Oh,
commuting to
oh,
London.
sorry, I got it backwards.
And
Okay.
I did a lot. So the program I did was economics and management, and it was a bachelor's that I did over the course of 3 years. And it was a complete distance program. So while doing it, I lived in Spain, I lived in Turkey, I lived in Germany, in Switzerland, in the UK. So basically, there were modules that you could do on site in London for weekends and blocks at a time. But the exams would even be in different locations around the world. So it
Cool.
was a program. Yeah.
And what was your PhD thesis about?
The PhD thesis was in the field of organizational psychology or management science, if you call it a science. And the thesis is titled Balancing Stability and Flexibility. And I studied engineering teams, mainly software development teams, and wrote about how they establish flexibility on the one side and be agile and have structures that allow them to pivot and follow customer needs. And on the other side, balance this flexibility with stability and processes that are more stable and give them structures that they can reliably use to innovate. It's kind of an exploration, exploitation topic.
And you did that in Switzerland at
I did that in Switzerland, in Zurich. Yeah.
Zurich. And so I'm curious, one of the sort of neat artifacts of this podcast is we get to talk to people who've, done PhDs from different places around the world. What is there I mean, is there a way that PhDs are done in Switzerland that might be different than elsewhere? For example, in North America, typically when you do a PhD, it's kind of like 2 years of coursework, and then you have comprehensive exams, and then you get to finally work on your thesis. At Oxford and Cambridge, it's all but
Yeah.
thesis, all but dissertation from day one. What was it like for you?
It's true. It depends a bit on the university, but also the German speaking culture for PhDs is that you're basically employed by the university and you work for one of the chairs and you have one professor that is your supervisor and you're also involved usually in the teaching. So it depends a little on the professors themselves how they handle it, but most would kind of have you do a lot of teaching in the beginning and then have you have more free time in the end of your PhD to focus more on the thesis. And it was pretty much like this for me as well. I was involved I love teaching actually. I liked also passing things on to students and actually learning by teaching. But I also like the quiet times when I could focus and write. Though the writing is always the harder part, and the teaching is kind of more an operational thing. You can do it, and you know what you, there's an output at the end of the day. You can correct exams, even though it's tedious, but you just know what you have to do. While writing is this open space where you have to structure the work yourself. So it's a lot harder, and at the same time, if you do it, also more fulfilling. I like the balance of both, and then of course in the procrastination days, you would tend towards just doing more teaching because that's easier to do, right?
Yeah, it's very interesting for a PhD is a multi-year project, and it's often very the writing and research part are often very self-directed, and so keeping up your mood and your productivity are two of the hardest things. I
Yeah.
remember I've got a doctorate in English literature, and one thing I remember there was kind of like kind of there's a million ways to divide people up into two types of people, but there were the kind of people who like 9 to 5 at the library, and
Yeah.
I'm in and I'm out. And then there were people who were like, kind of, well, no, this number of words per day or something like that. Did you fall into one of those two camps?
I didn't. I went to do my PhD at the same time with my wife, she's also an engineer, and she did her PhD in a very, very disciplined and structured way. So she was like this 9 to 5 type, while I procrastinate until 5 and then I start so it's
Right.
deep into the night. And I just keep going until I think I'm not productive anymore. And the thing of the PhD and also a book project for me is that it's a project you do basically by yourself. You don't have a team usually. So it's that when you skip a day, you just have to repeat the day. It's nobody does the work if you don't do it, right? So it also kept me pretty honest with myself on the days where I couldn't really focus. It wasn't worth going to any library because I thought I should spend this day somehow else. So I had to find a rhythm similar to like a weekend that was dividing my days into work days and non-work days. And I somehow ended up on a 10 to 1 rhythm. So every kind of
Interesting.
10 days, I would take a day off, even if it was a Wednesday or a
Yeah.
Thursday, I would just take that day off and then work through Saturday and Sunday. And actually the weekends were the best days to work because they were quiet. No emails coming in, nobody disturbing you. I liked the weekend days in the office. But then after the PhD, we had kids, and it's not
Oh,
possible to work on weekends anymore, though I loved that back in those days.
were you both finished your PhDs when you had kids?
Yeah, well, we finished in 2015 and 16, and then had our first son in 2018, so 3 years later.
Okay, okay. I have some friends who had kids during the PhD journey, and that was tricky.
Yeah, I think having kids is a challenge any time in the life. So there's no time when it fits in best, right? You just have to make room for it, and you
Mhm.
will because it's just such a fulfilling project in it itself.
Of course. Yeah, yeah. That's great to hear. And so, yeah, just before we move on to talk about the book, um, how did you meet your co-author, Rafael Huber?
I think I'm not even sure, but I think what I remember is we met during the pandemic when people shifted all their social life online, and there were these gatherings, and a mutual friend introduced us, and we went on a virtual kind of a walk, each person for himself with a common friend of ours, and we had these get to know new people over strange new ways online kind of experiences. And that's how we had our first call. A friend introduced us, and from the first moment we kind of clicked. Rafael's just a lot like me in the kind of in his love for books and in his love for thinking deeply about things and reflecting about the world. And then we worked at the same organization for a number of years, and always tried to find projects that we could do in common. So at some point we ended up settling on this microhabits topic. And that was we met so maybe 2020, 2021, and started writing or started working on the book maybe 2 years later in 2023. So until it was published, we had a good 2 years of a good hobby that we shared.
That's great. I'm definitely going to be asking you about how you shared the writing and
Yeah.
everything later. I actually do have one more kind of nerdy procedural question. So about your PhD. So did you do kind of like field research for that?
I
Like
did.
did you go into companies and teams and stuff
Yes.
like that?
Yes, a lot. So it was very, very applied. I did qualitative research. I was doing interviews and observations with a number of different companies and a lot of teams, and just basically try to live with these teams to understand how they work and how they structure their work and just how they
Did,
succeed.
did you get training on how to fit in? Read some old kind of
I
anthropology
actually
kind of studies or something like that?
they were all engineering teams, the teams that I studied, and they let me in with a lot of trust because they thought, hey, he's also kind of an engineer and he would get what we do. Although since I've worked with so many engineering teams, they have such deep knowledge that I could never understand what they do. But somehow many just give me the benefit of the doubt, and they trust me to just somehow understand what they do, even though I wouldn't say I do. And that was a lot of fun also to work with them and to just try to understand how they also technically what they do. But I was more interested in the social aspect of work and how work is structured and how routines get established and how memory is formed for the organization, and then also how they actually succeed in pivoting in their products and how decisions get made. These were all interesting questions that I pursued.
Yeah, definitely, definitely, and I love the balancing out of stability and flexibility as a kind of guiding kind of idea for a long work like that. That's just amazing. So in the next part of the interview, we're going to talk about the book directly, Micro Habits for Better Teamwork: Psychological Hacks with Great Impact. One line near the beginning that I really liked was the line about how hiring processes typically act as if talented people will automatically collaborate well.
Mhm.
And I love there was a little bit of a bite to that line,
Mhm.
as if just because they're talented in something means they'll actually be talented or even normal at collaborating with other people, which is a whole thing unto itself.
Yes. Yes. So I think we have a lot of structures that we introduce in organizations, and we trust the processes to do many, many tasks for us, like hiring, but also structuring work or assembling teams. And the structures that we establish, they only get us so far. The frameworks that we use, the project management methods. And so Rafael and I, what we tried to put together in this book was all that's missing that is not in the frameworks and structures and yeah, tools that we use. Because there's a lot of kind of the glue, or I don't know, maybe kind of the oil between the clock wheels that you need in order to succeed really with the team. It has to do a lot with communication. There's a lot of behaviors, the enactment of the structures, and living the processes, because just documenting a process and having it on paper doesn't mean it's working, as we all know. So there's a lot of I wouldn't say willpower, but there are many behaviors that we need in place, and they also have to do a lot with the intentions, how we go into situations, how we see the others that we collaborate with or don't collaborate with. There's also different nuances. There's some work is more coordination. We just have like little contracts that you
Right.
do this, we have our roles. And what we try to get at is real collaboration, which seems effortless and feels effortless. And it's not so easily done, as we all know. The question is, how do we get there? And then Rafael and I had the idea to make it easy and make it small and write about tiny habits that we can develop as teams that help us get into collaboration, real collaboration, a bit more automatically.
Mm.
As if we automatically get into this flow by just doing a sort of behavior. Yeah, some behaviors that help us.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to talking to you about some of the specific micro habits and things like that. But before we do, just sort of setting the stage a little bit, there was a line I didn't take clear enough notes or detailed enough notes. It was either in the foreword, so you didn't write it, or it was near the beginning of the book and you did write it. But there's a line about how employees at all levels of an organization now spend 50% more time working with others than they did just 20 years ago. And that
Yes.
that just kind of scrambled my kind of stereotype, right? Because a lot of the stereotypes, particularly about the kind of like, people who work with computers and stuff like that, is that like, they're it's all very isolating. It's all, I mean, it's, with the old kind of thing about programmers and engineers or whatever, antisocial and stuff like that. But what's behind that observation that actually people spend like 50% more time working with others than they did in the past?
Yeah. So in from team research, we know that the number of or the amount of work that gets done in teams is increasing, and teams do more and more complex problem solving tasks. That is more tasks that we have to solve as human beings. They get more and more complex, and then we need more knowledge, and no single person can hold so much knowledge. So we started to assemble cross-functional or interdisciplinary teams to do the work. Now, at this time in history, I'm wondering if we're maybe at a peak, and when AI is doing much more of the collaboration with us, that maybe means in the future there's maybe we're at the peak of what it means to have the amount of work that gets done in teams. I'm not sure. What is sure is that over the last decades, the work that we do in teams has been increasing. So 50 years ago, there weren't as many teams as we have today, and the work was more individualized, not completely individualized, but more than even 100 years ago. And this amount has been increasing until today.
And would that be, for example, I mean, like let's narrow our focus to kind of office work, for example. Was it more conventional in the past for like someone to be given a task, take it to their office, close their door, and then like finish that task and then give the output, like the memo or what have you?
That's how I imagine it, though
Right.
I don't know exactly how work got done 50 years ago. I imagine it also has to do a lot with the tools that we have. Nowadays, we have constant communication tools and synchronous communication tools, and the collaboration tools we use, they just enable us to be connected in real time so much to our coworkers that we can even think together, which was more limited, I imagine, a few decades ago.
Yeah, it's interesting too, and the kind of like asynchronous kind of collaboration as well that's enabled by things like, to pick an obvious example, Slack, for example. Like you can go see what happened on the Slack channel about X,
Yeah.
subject X, since you were last there. Like you can
Yeah.
kind of like, leave work for the day and come back and actually see what happened and like get an update on like what everybody's been more or less kind of up to and get all that context that you wouldn't have been able to do in the past.
Yes, for better or worse, right? There's
Yes.
people like Cal Newport who also argue that we need more focus time and kind of we're drowning in noise also from all the notifications that we get with all the what's not really relevant for me, but I still have access to the information. So I tend to check my emails constantly and all of this behavior.
One micro habit that you talk about in this section. So yeah, I should frame this. You have 7 key behavioral areas that you address in the book: compassion and curiosity, transparency and clarity, psychological safety, needs before solutions, testing assumptions, candid kindness, and taking ownership. And the micro habit, and the book has that with respect to each of those 7 kind of key behavioral areas. There's micro habits that are suggested at the end of each section. And for the compassion and curiosity one, there's one of the micro habits is not framing statements as leading questions.
Mhm.
I love that one because that's a pet peeve of mine. But it's when people do that, but it's deeper than that, right? There's actually a problem, or at least one big problem with actually paving what are in fact leading like statements as leading questions.
Yes, yes. That is, and there's an interesting tool for that. We learned it from Roger Schwartz. He suggested the test if we're really asking curious, real questions and not leading questions is that basically when we have the answer to a question, then it's not a real question. And the test that suggested is the you idiot test. And it goes like this. It's pretty funny
Hmm.
actually.
Hmm.
When you have a question and then in your head you can do comma, you idiot. Like for example, Rafael, do you really think we should submit that presentation in this format? You idiot. It sounds like a real question that you could actually pose. And the advice is to not state the question because you could add you idiot at the end. So you have to make something out of the question that gets the real curiosity. And first of all, it needs to be a statement because it's not a question. I know the answer, right? Rafael, I'm trying to tell him we should not submit that presentation in that format. So I would make a statement first,
Right.
but then add also some context and add some humbleness in order to show that I might also be wrong. So I have to make something where you idiot doesn't make sense. That might be something like, so I think we shouldn't submit it in this format because I have a different experience from the past project where they criticized what we submitted. So let's be more curious about, I don't know, let's not submit it because I would advise against it. On the other hand, it might be good enough. And can you explain to me why you think that may be valid? What am I not seeing? You idiot. So when I give all this long sentence, you idiot doesn't make sense anymore. And that means my intention is clearer. It's more transparent in that way.
And in addition, it has the feature of you've committed yourself to something.
Yes.
explicitly, you've committed yourself to a position rather than dodging or evading and one of the things about the kind of like framing the statement as the leading question is that it's a dominance move. It kind of puts all the responsibility on the other person, and it kind of assumes a kind of like hierarchical priority for yourself, right?
Yes.
That you don't get to be questioned. Because if you just say, I think we shouldn't submit the presentation this way, then other people get to go, why? And then you have to justify yourself.
Yes. You
Um,
have much better conversation in that way when you go to this place. While in from rhetoric, we know that questions are a way to try to control the conversation. And when we pose questions that we know the answer to, that's always manipulation. That's kind of a manipulation of the other. That's trying to control the conversation and to steer it in some direction. While when we're honest with ourselves, we might not have the answer to everything. We think we know everything. And here's the basic stance that we put into the microhabits framework. The stance behind that is two different modes of thinking. One is when we go into a situation, maybe even the default, the go-to mode is that we try to control what we cannot control because there's so much uncertainty, and the conversation becomes kind of a chess game or a poker game. I have this information that I think is true, and we need this to make the presentation this way or that way. So I'm trying to lay out my arguments, and these are like my poker cards. And what we try to argue for in micro habits is that we shouldn't treat conversations like a poker game. We should instead think of these cards that we have like puzzle pieces. And the puzzle game is not a game that you can win or lose. It's a totally different game. Because in the puzzle, we have information and we need to admit that the other people also have information. And it becomes a different game in that we have to puzzle these pieces together. So it's kind of this is my view, here's my information. And I need to be curious and ask real question or to find out what pieces of puzzle do you have, what you bring to the table. And we need to find out how they fit together, if they fit together, if there's something missing that we don't see in this round. So the puzzle game is a totally different game. It's a collaborative game. And that's where we want to go to with micro habits. So each of these 7 behavioral dimensions, we try to suggest behaviors that we can enact from the puzzle mindset. And when we think puzzle, we would automatically not ask leading question and not make you idiot statements and be more humble and more collaborative. And the basic assumption is that when we do this, it might take a little more time in the beginning, but we're much more efficient in the long run. It's kind of a repeated game. When we have repeated interactions, when we have projects that run for months or years, and we establish relationships in which we play puzzle together instead of poker against each other, we get much better results in a much quicker time.
yeah, that's really great. I actually personally I haven't come across the metaphor of the puzzle game being used that way before, but that really conveys a great deal. And I mean, of course, I think about all the times I've played the puzzle game, with like my grandma or my cousins or my friends or my girlfriend or what have you. You're delighted when someone finds the piece that fits that you've been looking for.
Yes.
It's like, oh, and you feel good that thank God that part finally got finished. Or if you're
Yes.
puzzling over where something should go, and they're like, no, that's the cloud, not the tiger's tooth, or something
Yeah.
like that. You're like, oh right, of course, and the way that all fits together, that's really great. I guess the closest I
It
think I've
shows
heard,
that we're on the same team, right? In
yeah,
the poker game, we're not on the same team, but in the puzzle game, we are on the same team. We're actually, even if it is a conflict, we are on the same team against the conflict. It's not the conflict between us. It's not you and against me.
mm-hmm,
It's us together against some hard problem that we need to solve together.
mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, that
That's
no, that's amazing. Um, the uh, the section on transparency and clarity really struck me. That's one of my hobby horses, and you talk about how ambiguity breeds understanding.
Mhm.
That words that carry more than one meaning, words can carry more than one meaning, basically.
Yeah.
Um, and I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that. Was that from your own personal kind of experience and frustration that you we're preoccupied with that particular problem? Because I would venture to say that like a lot of people don't understand what one means when one talks about things like this as a problem.
Mhm. Also, from my own experience, of course, there's lots of misunderstandings and ambiguities that we could avoid, but we don't, because when I talk, it is so clear to me. Then I forget what I really what you might not know. And it's little examples. We is an example word for this. Or in my work with software teams, we have this definition of done. So there's kind of an explicit statement of what does it mean if a task is done, because it might be done for me, and I think that's good, and everything that it needs is there, but it might not be done for the team. That the kind of you don't know what I really did in order to perceive it as done. But let's go back to the we. We is something that is inherently ambiguous because it's not clear who has to do something with that. If at the end of a meeting I say we need to do a follow-up meeting, it's not clear who invites, who organizes it, if there's anybody feeling accountable for that at all. So the advice in microhabits is to clarify these words, to clarify important words. It could be important words like team, who's on the team, or product, what's our product. But start with we. I had this experience myself in my PhD when we needed to write a proposal for a research grant. And then after 2 years, the proposal wasn't written and no grant was solicited. And then my professor came to me and said, "Hey, Dennis, we need to really write this." And I was assuming that she's in the lead writing this, but she assumed that I am in the lead writing this. So we had a tough but interesting conversations about who was we. And that was clarified pretty quickly then, but after 2 years. And microhabits wants to prevent us from these long times of thinking that we are in alignment, but we're not. So nowadays, having this habit to kind of clarify important words, I have kind of an alarm bell that goes on in my head when I hear the word we. And if somebody suggests at the end of a meeting suggests that we need to do a follow-up meeting, I would immediately ask, who do you mean by we? Are you expecting me to do something? Otherwise, I would not, right? And if it is explicit, if it is clearly stated, it's much more clear, and we avoid disappointment. Like all the participants have less disappointment in this.
This is probably a kind of meta question, I guess, about that would bring in psychological safety into the conversation. But one of the things I've found that makes it so difficult to do things like you are in a sense when you pause things to say we need to clarify our terms, you are kind of, at least in a sense, it seems like you're kind of slowing things down in the moment, hopefully for the sake of greater productivity and efficiency and speed in the long run. But a lot of people hate it when you pause to sort of clarify language. They think it's a waste of time. They think it's, of course we all know what and there's this kind of false realism, this kind of, like fool's gold, like fool's realism about it. We don't need to stop and talk about terminology. And then often I think because, then it becomes very difficult actually for a lot of people to go, no, like
Yes.
we actually don't all have a shared understanding of what this word is. So how would you, for example, like if you were trying to introduce the idea of this specific micro habit of like, no, it's okay, and in fact good for us to pause things when we're talking and define our terms, but there was a culture where it wasn't kind of safe to do that. How would you instruct a kind of manager who's read this book and is trying to bring that micro habit into their team? How would you suggest they deal with that kind of conflict?
First, I think there's the understanding, and I believe everybody can relate to having had a misunderstanding while a word or a term or a concept wasn't clarified, and what that caused, and the circles that we redo because we have to go back and clarify. So I think there's an understanding that it causes inefficiencies to not clarify. And then there's also some common sense we need to apply when we interrupt people and pause the whole conversation for the sake of let's sidetrack this and we need to clarify, let's have a definition first. That can also be very tedious. So we need to apply some common sense in when it's more or less relevant. Oftentimes when I facilitate, I do a lot of work facilitating group works, and I would listen to a conversation until I get the feeling that there is a misunderstanding and then probe, test my assumption that I have the feeling here's a misunderstanding of the word. Sometimes it's a quick question. It can be an abbreviation when somebody says, we need to also clarify the QCA agreement of such and such. And everybody nods in agreement, but 2 sentences later, I get the feeling that I didn't really understand what they mean. And I would just in a side sentence say, by the way, could you just say what you mean by QCA? And then I would not make it a conversation
Right.
in itself. I would just have it a kind of let this thing be a little thing. While in a different term, product or team or something bigger, that when I also get the feeling that there's a misunderstanding about it, I would first probe and say, I have the feeling we are not understanding the same thing under this term. And there is basically no stupid questions. Either it's a small question and it's quick to clarify, so it doesn't sidetrack us for an hour. It's just maybe a 30-second thing. Or the other case, it is really worth clarifying it because we all have a different understanding of it. And then even if we spend 2 minutes or 5 minutes on it, it will save us 5 minutes in the long run easily. So it's never kind of a cost that we invest in clarifying things.
Is there this is just a question that just occurred to me, but is there a way you know of in kind of recruitment or interviewing that can help one identify people who would be better communicators with respect to this kind of thing than others?
I think I tend to watch when I do hiring interviews, I tend to look for this kind of behavior. That when I explain a certain context for which I need a person and I hire a person when I'm in that role, and when candidates ask clarifying questions and also admit that they don't know instead of pretending, because you have this not an imposter, you have this impression management also that's going on a lot in hiring.
Mm-hmm.
And when people come off their horse and not try to manage the impression and try to be all knowing, but we all know we're not all knowing. The more humble we are, I think these are better team workers in the end. So I tend to watch for this behavior. Are people asking questions? Do they try to understand really instead of just giving answers?
Yeah, no, that sounds really great. Yeah, I like the idea of impression management. I haven't heard it put quite that way, but that, of course, exactly captures how a certain. I mean, everybody in the job interview is going to be, managing their impression to some degree.
To some extent, yeah.
But if it's to the point where if you're preoccupied with like, if you think that asking questions means you've failed somehow, and therefore you should hide the fact that you have questions to ask somehow. Yeah, that would be a bad sign. Um, you talk about the 4 stages of psychological safety in the book, and one of those I just wanted to sort of dive into one of those, which is challenger safety, which you call the 4th and most demanding stage. What is in the context of talking about like organizational psychology and psychological safety? What is challenger safety?
These 4 stages, they come from a framework by Timothy Clark, and he proposed psychological safety being not a concept that is yes or no. It's not 1 or 0. You have stages that you go through, and you have different levels of psychological safety in the team. Psychological safety being defined as the kind of the willingness or the acceptance of interpersonal risk, meaning that I'm asking stupid questions, even though somebody might roll their eyes or think, hey, Dennis, what a stupid question was this? If I'm asking it anyways, it's a sign of psychological safety. And that would be on a level of, he starts with inclusion safety. I belong to this team, up to learner safety. We're open to take responsibility and can make mistakes on a team. And challenger safety is the 4th stage in Clark's model. That's the ultimate stage where we are allowed on a team to challenge the status quo, meaning we are allowed to suggest changes to the process and say things like, I think we have we haven't really have clarified our responsibilities in a good way. We need to reshape the roles in which we work, and I propose things that could actually change the structures of the team itself. And if that is not held against me in terms of Dennis just has a political agenda or something, or a hidden agenda, if it's really listened to and taken in as a suggestion that we need to consider in order to improve the teamwork, then we're on this level where we have challenger safety. It's also something, these 4 stages, they're something that we go through very quickly. They're very dynamic. In one meeting, I can go to the 4th stage and suggest a comment, and then maybe somebody shuts me down in the meeting, and I notice that, oh, that was maybe a comment that's not so accepted here. So I fall back to the first level, and it can happen very quickly. Of course, when I teach psychological safety courses, I have this message that we should all try to get the others to level 4. How we perceive psychological safety in the team, that's one thing, but what behaviors we display that get the others to level 4, that is really increasing psychological safety in the teams.
Yeah, yeah. One of the things that you talk about for increasing psychological safety as well, and I'm just looking at the micro habits for that section here right now, is modeling vulnerability and uncertainty, for example. Something that I've had arguments with coworkers about like, why it's actually very important to model uncertainty in the way you speak, and that it's not a way of softening the blow or something like that, or being apologetic, or being indirect. It's a way of articulating a fact of the matter, which is that there's uncertainty.
It's true. It also takes a lot of courage. Usually because we tend to be seen as weaker when we show, or we believe it's weaker, while in reality, it's much stronger to show vulnerability. We're in a much weaker position when we tend to, or we pretend to know something. When we admit that we don't know and we don't have all the answers, on the one hand, that models that it's okay to not be perfect, which is very, very important for the learning culture and the feedback culture in the team. On the other hand, it's just the reality, because we don't know everything. It's also the case that we shouldn't kind of stop ourselves in analysis paralysis because
Right.
we don't know, we cannot do something. It's okay to move forward while not knowing, or we should stay open to reconsider and correct when we have more information. That again, for me, is a balance between stability and flexibility, right? Staying open to be flexible and stay open to new possibilities, while also commit to a time when we just try something and say, for the next 2 weeks, let's just try this idea. And then at the end, stop and think and reflect, was it really getting us in a positive direction, or should we do something slightly different?
One of the tools for psychological safety that you talk about is honesty through self-disclosure. And I've found that's very, very convincing. When I was reading that, I was thinking about my own personal experience, both doing that, but experience encountering other people doing that. And when, for example, just to put it kind of not too finely, good leaders are excellent at telling their own story about the mistake they made that one time, and things like that.
Yes, absolutely. Would you
Yeah.
like to share a story, or what resonates with you exactly? Do you have an example or a story to share? Would be interesting.
I guess it's something I use often, because when you're telling a story, you get to bring up as many whatever details you like about it. And so it's not a form of manipulation, but it's a form of very kind of effective communication, because
Yes.
you can structure the story around, and you only need to put in the details that you want to for your story, and people they get into story listening mode.
Yes.
And then maybe if they might start to identify with you because you're the one that's struggling in a difficult situation, and they want when you watch the story of the hero, you want the hero to succeed, even if they're a bad guy, famously. And so, as long as it's not not taken as a form of boasting, but an example of a story that I was just telling today along those lines was, when I was an undergrad, a summer job I had was tree planting. And that if you don't know what that is, it sounds very pleasant, and it is not a pleasant job. Like you would plant you could plant up to 6,000 trees a day kind of thing, right? And it was like piecework. So you got paid per tree, and it
Okay.
came with all the management practices and stuff like that you would imagine that would come with piecework. And but you're working on the mountainside, basically, out exposed to the elements. And one thing I had to learn was like, if it's raining today, it's raining today.
Okay. Yes.
There's no, and it took me a while to actually internalize it. Like it's easy to say that, but to
Yeah.
actually internalize, you're just going to have to deal with the rain. It's no one's fault. This is the
Mm-hmm.
job you signed up for.
Mm-hmm.
And once you can kind of get over the ordinary preoccupation you would have with like getting out of the rain,
Mm-hmm.
or, I wish I had a better raincoat or a better hat or something like that. And it's like, no, you're in this, you can improve later, but right now you're in the situation that you're in. So
Mm-hmm.
that's kind of what I mean when I'm thinking about the
Mm-hmm.
self-disclosure. And when you
Yeah.
tell it that way, it's kind of like, well, there I was, kind of a wimp, right at
Yeah.
the beginning of I'm admitting that like I was, well, no, it's raining, but I took a job working outside in the mountains all day long. So who am I to, but none, anyway, that's kind of what I was thinking about.
That is interesting. Yeah. Powerful. Yeah. Thanks.
Yeah. And so, yeah, just I'm not going to go through them all completely in order, but just to give people a feeling of how the book is sort of very carefully structured. So one thing you talk about is testing assumptions.
Mhm.
So that can mean a lot of different things.
Yes.
What do you mean by testing assumptions?
In microhabits, we meet it really on a small scale and small behavioral things. An example would be when I give a keynote at some place, and I'm of course I'm uncertain if I really have the right address and the right location and the right time. I would just send an email to the people who invite me and say, by the way, I will be in this address at this time to meet you for kind of preparing and be there for the keynote. Let me know if that is not correct. So I have this assumption, okay, this is what's in my calendar because I put it in. Am I really certain about it? Not 100%, maybe 90%. So I'm writing this and tell people, this is my assumption. Let me know if it's incorrect. And we can do this also with behaviors. We can do this when I was collaborating on the book with my co-author, and he might have had a bad day, and I sense that he is skeptical to something that I say, and I'm testing my assumption. I say, hey, Rafael, you're really looking skeptical about what I'm talking about. Is it that my idea is somehow bothering you? And he might say either yes, Dennis, and then we have a good conversation, or he might say no, it's because my boys woke me up at 4 in the morning and I haven't slept. So it doesn't have to do with you. Not everything I think is about me, right? That's also a bias that we have. So if I don't test these assumptions, I would
I
go
see.
into actions based on what I think. It's just a story in my head. It might be also a small thing, but it might be a big thing. It could be as big as starting a project and we're having different assumptions why it might or might not work, and they might not be true. So on the
I
small
see.
scale, but also on a big scale, that's relevant.
So I guess if you're in a meeting planning or potentially a big new project, you could test an assumption by saying, so when we get to the end of this and we're all millionaires,
Hmm.
A, B, C, D, and then they might be like, oh no, none of us are getting rich off this kind of thing. Um,
That's an example. Yes. Yeah.
okay, yeah, that's very direct, and then that's one of the things I love about the book is that like it's a lot of it, a lot of it kind of can seem kind of subtle on a certain from a certain direction, but it's actually very very practical.
And the principle behind all of these microhabits is to make things explicit, because explicit is better than implicit. When they're implicit, they're just in our heads, and we don't know if the other people think the same. So teamwork benefits a lot from having shared mental models, having shared understandings of how we see the world. And this is done by testing assumptions and by sharing information, laying out our puzzle pieces and saying, this is how I see it. How do you? Yeah.
So in all podcasts nowadays, just before we move on to the last part where we talk about your approach to writing this book, uh, in all podcasts, there's now the obligatory, how is AI going to change everything?
Yes.
Segment. So if you wouldn't mind taking a couple of minutes, as an expert in organizational psychology and things like that, uh, I guess like to frame it in a kind of tacky way, like what's your biggest concern for how the use of AI, and we're talking about like Claude and Chat GPT and stuff like that, is going to affect organizational psychological models in companies?
For work, my concern is that we we're probably prone to drowning in a sea of noise that is created that we can't really check or not even fact check, but also grasp. The amount of under information that we're exposed to is just exponentially growing, so that it's impossible to make sense of all of this. That's a concern that I have, and a threat even. On the other side, I see a lot of upsides in use of AI, and it's from an economic perspective, I also have a lot of hope and a lot of optimism in seeing new technologies as opportunities.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, that's been my experience so far in my limited way with kind of like there's just so much coming out of everybody, so much, kind of new feature suggestions, and like not just suggestions, but like now there they are. You can see them, whether the code is all that great or not. They're working. And people can have like, what we typically have like 9 Claudes going at the same time, for Leanpub team members, if we're really, really kind of maxing out the tokens at the time.
Yeah.
But there's just so much. And then there's the weird feeling of like not having produced enough. And it's like, is quantity, there's all these like very practical questions. It's like, how many features? Is that like the equivalent of like, well, how many lines of code as a productivity measure?
Yeah.
How good was the code? How good are those features? Are they part of a kind of product kind of vision, or are you just kind of making all your own problems go away? So yeah, thanks very much for sharing that. I really that's very convincing, I think. So yeah, just moving on to the last part of the podcast where we talk about writing. So you talked a little bit about how you approached writing your PhD. Um, how that was not collaborative, I imagine, not co-authored anyway. So how did you co-author this book together?
We settled for a mode where we didn't divide up the chapters. We said it needs to be one flow, and the book needs to feel like it's coming from one mind, one voice. And while Rafael and I, we, as I said, we click a lot. We also have different perspectives and we have different writing styles. So we settled on the mode where I would do the first draft entirely. I took a month off and I
Hmm.
locked myself in
Hmm.
libraries mainly. Also, I
Okay.
have an office where I wrote a lot. So I finished the first draft, which was maybe around 60 pages. I don't know how many, 20,000 words, something like that. I can't remember the exact number. And I went into this month after we had settled on the skeleton of the book. So we had a lot of weekends where we locked ourselves in as the two of us, and we talked about what should the chapters be, what content do we want to put into this, what are the 7, is it even 7 dimensions? We had this huge whiteboard at one point where we just tried to make sense of everything that we want to put into this book, and we had drawings and arrows, and so the skeleton work that took us a few weekends and nights. And we had a lot of kind of texting going back and forth of, hey, I have this idea. This also needs to go in. How do where does it fit in for you? Kind of these discussions. And then after the skeleton was kind of ready, we know, okay, this could be the 7 chapters of the body of the book. And then we need an introduction chapter to have more of the theory that we want to put in and explain why these are relevant. And then also a third part of the book at the end where we try to translate it into what we do in practice. We do a lot of workshops and trainings with microhabits. So we have experience in how you translate this for real teams and get it into day-to-day work. So this needed also to be one part. And the skeleton was there. Then I took a month off and just wrote the whole thing. I just locked myself in, and I actually had this goal to say, today I will finish chapter 2, no matter what happens. And if I'm done at noon, that's good. If I'm done at midnight, that will be it. I will sit here until I'm done. And after the month, I had 60 some pages as a kind of shitty first draft
Yeah.
to send to Rafael, and he then worked over the whole draft and did the second version of the whole thing, and then I did it again, and then he did it again. So it was like you have these in French cuisine, you have the bakery style that you do for croissants, like the mille-feuille. It's like one layer, another,
Right.
another,
Yeah.
knead it again, and then it starts again.
Right.
This is
Right.
how we spent a few more months just reworking the whole thing over and over and say, yeah, but the structure was there, the skeleton was there, the story, uh, the stories were kind of in our heads, and it was just the months that I took was basically just writing it down. It was a lot of fun, other than kind of compared to the PhD work where um, you're not really sure where you end up with. Here, we had set out the goal in a really clear way, so it was just the execution. And then compared to I come from leading teams and having my calendar full of meetings and people issues and all kinds of management things. And to take a month off felt like a sabbatical. I was really free, no meetings, nothing in the calendar except for me and a cup of coffee and a chapter to write. So that was really a joy for me.
That's such a fantastic story. I'm so glad to hear that. And the idea of I mean, I think everybody listening to be a month off, but to work. But when it's on something you care about and you're going to go deep, I mean, those are the best times. The last question I have on the podcast, typically, if the author has been using Leanpub, is if there was one magical feature we could build for you, or if there was one thing that had you or your co-author shaking your fist at Leanpub, going, "Damn you! Why does this suck so bad?" that we could fix for you, is there anything you can think of that you would ask us to build or fix?
Actually, I have to disappoint you, not on off the top of my head. One question that I have though is why did you decide the ruler where you can basically have an author set the price, but then have the customer correct the price? That is something I was always curious about.
So that we call those the pricing sliders.
Yeah.
My somewhat not the best kind of term for it is variable pricing, because that is a real thing in sort of marketing and economics. But I call it the variable pricing model. We call those pricing sliders. The reason for that is that we pay a much higher royalty rate than self-publishing platforms typically pay, and a much higher royalty rate than anybody's going to get if they buy a book that's published by a conventional publisher. So, the kind of like ordinary math is like if you buy a book, people think if they buy like a $40 book at the bookstore, wow, that author sure making money off me. And it's like, no, the publisher got half of that,
Yes,
and
at
the
least.
author may have gotten 10% of that. So you spent $40 on that book, and the author may in a year get $2 from
Yeah.
that sale. Whereas with Leanpub, it's 80%. So if we're like, and so like so one thing is like we wanted to highlight, I think probably the way it evolved was we showed like how much the author's going to get. So, and then so there's two sliders. And the one thing we noticed right away when we implemented the slider thing was that people were paying odd prices. And it's like, oh, it's because they're dragging the author gets slider around to how much they want to pay the author.
Yeah.
And so one of the reasons we did that was that well, basically Leanpub's a self-publishing platform. So people are much more confident in self-publishing nowadays, like buying self-published books nowadays than they were in the past. But also Leanpub books are published in progress. So there's this unfinished self-published book. How much should I pay for it? And it's like when we give people choice, it just dramatically changes their relationship. Even if they pay the suggested price that the author set, they don't change it. The fact that they can choose, my kind of unscientific view is that giving people choice of how much to pay like that actually makes them feel very empowered, and basically it's respectful. And because our royalty rate is so high, you kind of take how much is Leanpub going to get out of it, out of the picture. And it's like, oh, how much, and often people actually slide to the right. They pay more because they're like, oh, the author has undervalued themselves. And so by giving people the choice, you get all these kind of potential positive benefits, including signaling around pricing. People are moving it to the left, lower. Well, maybe I should lower my suggested price. But if the best signal obviously is people are moving it to the right, so I should actually probably raise my price. People think I'm pricing myself too low. So it was a combination of wanting of kind of acknowledging the choice that someone's making, buying an unfinished self-published book. But also trying to give them the positive benefits of empowering them and saying, we trust you to choose to pay what you think is fair based on the presentation of the books, kind of like, about the book and about the author and sample book and all that kind of stuff. So those were
I find it really interesting. So yeah.
Yeah, thanks.
Cool.
Yeah, no, thanks for that. Yeah, that's a great question. And that's one of the things that makes us relatively unique.
Yes.
Well, Denniz, the book is Micro Habits for Better Teamwork, Psychological Hacks with Great Impact. Thank you so much for taking the time out of the early morning for you and later in the evening for me to talk to all of us on the podcast today about your really great book and your great work.
Thanks so much for your time. That was really fun talking with you. Thank you.
Thanks.